On the night George Carlin first performed what would become known as "A Place for My Stuff," the audience did not laugh immediately. This is worth paying attention to. Carlin had been performing for more than 2 decades by the time this bit made its first appearance. He knew how material worked, knew in the specific technical sense of a craftsman who has spent years understanding his tools, how to build a premise that the audience could follow, how to pace the information so that the setup produced the response before the response became impatient. He was not a performer who regularly produced silence where laughter should have been. But on this particular night, the first time he laid out the premise, the observation that all the complexity of human behavior around possessions, around real estate, around the systems people build to organize their physical lives, could be understood through a single lens, the room held what he had said for a few seconds before responding. Not the silence of material that is not landed, the different silence, the specific quiet of a room that has just heard something and is in the process of deciding what it has heard. This distinction is important. Comedy rooms are not usually quiet. The architecture of stand-up is built on the assumption that silence is failure, that the absence of laughter is the signal that something has gone wrong. Comedians learn early to fear silence and to avoid it, to fill it before it can establish itself as a judgment on the material. But there is another kind of silence that happens in comedy rooms, rarely and unpredictably, and that is not failure. It is the silence that comes when a premise has been stated in a form that is simple enough that the audience cannot yet see where it is going, and that is also true enough that the audience needs a moment to absorb the truth before it becomes funny. This was that kind of silence. Carlin stood in it. He did not rush to fill it. He had been in this room, the room where a thought lands before the audience knows what to do with it, enough times to recognize the specific quality of what was happening. The thought was, all the possessions you own, all the systems you have built around managing them, all the decisions you make about where to live and how to organize your life, it is all just a place for your stuff. That is what you are doing. You have built an entire life around the storage and management of your things. The room held this for a few seconds, and then someone understood it, and then the room understood it, and then everything changed. What Carlin knew, as the room found the laughter, was something the audience was still in the process of catching up to. The bit was not finished. The premise had been stated, and the room had recognized it, had followed the observation down to its physical basis, and found the truth funny in the way that accurate observations about the organizing principles of daily life tend to be funny. But the bit had a second movement, and the second movement was the thing that separated it from a clever observation about possessions. The second movement extended the premise to its full implication. If everything you do is fundamentally about managing your stuff, then what does that say about the other things you believe your life is organized around? The relationships, the achievements, the experiences you accumulate, are those also, in some final analysis, things you are managing? Items in a different category of stuff, stored in a different kind of space, but subject to the same basic logic? This was where the bit moved after the initial recognition, and it was the place that made it something more than a funny observation about materialism. It was the place where the comedy opened onto something that was not exactly funny. The recognition that the logic of stuff, once you see it clearly, has implications that extend well beyond furniture and storage space.
Carlin did not push this implication all the way. He was a comedian, not a philosopher, and the material had to remain comedy rather than becoming a meditation. But he gestured at it, gave the audience enough to see the full reach of the observation without leaving the terrain of the funny. This is the specific skill of the very best observational comedy. The ability to point at the full implication without going all the way to it.
To leave the audience at the edge of the deeper recognition, where the laughter is tinged with something that exceeds laughter, where what is funny is also slightly unsettling. The room held this without knowing entirely that it was holding it. They were laughing. The bit was working. But underneath the laughter, the observation was doing its other work, the work of the true thing that remains with the audience after the laugh has faded. Carlin had been building toward this specific quality in his work for years. The material that was funny on its surface and true in a more durable way underneath. The bit that you laughed at in the room and thought about on the drive home. A Place for My Stuff was one of the cleaner examples of this quality, one of the bits where the surface observation and the deeper implication were in perfect proportion, neither overwhelming the other. In the years after its first performance, the bit was refined. Not substantially changed, the core was right from the beginning, as the core of Carlin's best material tended to be, but developed, expanded in certain sections, tightened in others, given the specific rhythmic precision that characterized his finished performances. But the essential thing, the observation, the reduction, the gesture toward the implication, was there from the first night. It was there in the few seconds of silence before the room understood, and it was there in the sustained laughter that followed. The two things together, the silence and the laughter. That is what the best comedy produces, and the silence comes first. To understand why the room hesitated before it understood A Place for My Stuff, it helps to understand what the bit is actually saying, because what it is saying is, at first encounter, more radical than it sounds. On the surface, it is a comedy observation about possessions. Carlin observes that everything people do in their adult lives, the decisions about where to live, the acquisition of furniture and clothing and equipment, the maintenance of houses and apartments, the transactions of moving from one location to another, can be understood, at the most basic level, as the ongoing management of the stuff they own. The house is not primarily a home. It is primarily a place to put your stuff. The hotel room is a temporary place to put the small amount of stuff you need for a short period. The car is a place to put the stuff you need while you are between your places for stuff. At this level of summary, the bit sounds simply true, which it is. And that is, partly, why the room hesitated. The premise is stated so plainly that the first response is not laughter, it is recognition. The recognition that happens when something you have always known is said in a form you have never heard before. But the bit is doing something more than observing a truth. It is using that observation to reverse a set of assumptions that most people carry about what their possessions mean, about what the accumulation of things and the systems built to manage them says about the human life organized around them. The prevailing assumption in the culture Carlin was addressing in the early 1980s was that possessions were significant, that what you owned said something about who you were, that the quality and quantity of your stuff was a meaningful indicator of the quality and meaning of your life. This was not a new assumption. It was woven into the structure of American consumer culture and had been for decades. But it was also, in the early 1980s, reaching a specific intensity as the material prosperity of the post-war era had produced generations of adults for whom the management and accumulation of possessions was a primary adult activity. What Carlin's bit does is strip this assumption down to its physical basis. It does not argue against possessions or against the desire for them. It does not moralize or prescribe. It simply describes, in the flat, direct, genuinely observational language that was characteristic of his best work, what is actually happening when a person organizes their life around the management of their things. It is just stuff. A place for your stuff. That is the entire architecture of the adult material life. The comedy in this is the comedy of accurate reduction, of taking something large and complicated and showing, with surgical precision, the simple physical fact underneath all the complexity. The laughter comes when the audience follows the observation all the way down to the physical fact and recognizes that the physical fact is both completely obvious and somehow something they had never quite seen before. This is what the room was doing in those few seconds of silence, following the observation down to the physical fact, and then arriving at the recognition. And when the recognition arrived, when the room understood what it was being shown, the response was not the quick response of a well-constructed joke. It was the sustained response of a truth that had been seen clearly for the first time. The room was still laughing when the bit had moved on to its next section. 4 decades after its first performance, A Place for My Stuff remains one of the most recognized pieces of material from George Carlin's career. This is not surprising in retrospect, given what the bit does, but it is worth thinking about specifically, about why this particular observation from a career full of observations became the one that the most people associate with his name. The bit is not the most technically complex material Carlin ever produced. He built more elaborate arguments, constructed more sophisticated language-based premises, performed material that was more immediately ambitious in its scope. A Place for My Stuff is, by his own standards, a relatively simple observation. But it is also, by any standard, an immediately accessible truth. The observation is available to everyone who hears it, not just the people who bring a particular cultural or intellectual frame to the comedy, but everyone who owns things, which is everyone. The truck driver and the professor and the retired school teacher and the teenager hearing Carlin for the first time all arrive at the recognition at the same moment. The laughter is the laughter of shared recognition, rather than the laughter of those who have caught the reference. This is one of the things that separates the comedy that endures from the comedy that is excellent in its moment, but does not travel. The comedy that endures tends to be built on observations that are simultaneously specific and universal. Specific enough to be precise, universal enough to be recognized by anyone. A Place for My Stuff achieves this. The observation is about a specific human activity, the accumulation and management of possessions, but it names that activity in a way that the audience immediately applies to their own experience. The stuff is their stuff. The place is their place. The recognition is personal. Carlin understood this quality in material. He had spent decades learning to distinguish between the observation that was accurate and the observation that was accurate and inevitable, the one that, once stated, seemed like it could not have been left unstated. A place for my stuff is an inevitable observation. Once you hear it, it is impossible to hear it for the first time again. On the night of its first performance, the room did not know this yet. The room was in the few seconds of silence before it understood, and then in the laughter after it understood, and the night continued and the show concluded and the audience went home. But they took the observation with them. And some of them, driving home or lying awake later, thought about their house, about their apartment, about the car they had parked in the garage, about all the systems they had built around all the things they owned, about the stuff. And they recognized, in that private moment, that the comedian had said something true that they had always known and had never heard said plainly. That is the job. That is the specific job that the best comedy does. Not to tell the audience something they didn't know. To say plainly the thing they already knew in a form they had never heard before, in a way that makes the already known suddenly visible. The room went silent for a few seconds on the first night, and then the room understood. And then the room laughed for a very long time.